Hello again, and welcome to our continued study of the book of 2 Samuel. We've been studying the books of 1 and 2 Samuel during this quarter, and we'll be moving on to chapter 17 through 20 in this particular study, which will be our next to last one for the book of 2 Samuel. If you'd like to get in touch with us, this screen here shows how you can do that. If you would like to look at a lesson that you may have missed from before, if you want to look at other lessons that we have posted, if you'd just like to get in touch with us, this is the way to do that, and we'd be glad to hear from you about whatever needs you might have, and we're glad that you joined in today with our study of 2 Samuel. If you want to be turning your Bibles to the book of 2 Samuel, it will be good to have your Bibles open for chapter 17 through 20, and we will be considering the high points, and you can look along with the rest of the text as that is helpful to you as we study. We've been using basically this outline here of 2 Samuel from the Nelson's Complete Book of Bible Maps and Charts, and as you see there near the bottom, we are studying chapters 17 through 20, which involves a rebellion in David's own family, his son Absalom, what happens to Absalom, and then how David is restored as the king of all of Israel. As we begin to look at these verses, it's good for us to look at the map that you see before you there to get a feel for where these things are going to take place in relation to one another. Of course, we see there Hebron, with the green arrow coming out of it. That's where Absalom began his rebellion, gathered together the forces that were on his side, made his way toward Jerusalem. David learns of this, and he flees Jerusalem with those who were with him, a number which is quickly joined, apparently, by a lot of other Jews, because he finally has a rather large army by the time a battle takes place. He crosses the Jordan River, makes his way up to the river Jabbok, and into the land, the northern part of the land known as Gilead. Some of the places there that you see will be mentioned in our text that we'll consider today. The place called the Forest of Ephraim, some texts call it the Woods of Ephraim, is the place where the battle is going to actually occur. And the placing of that is going to have a bearing upon its outcome, as not just the number of soldiers and the swords and the weapons that take place, but also the actual terrain itself is going to play a part within that. So with this map in mind for where these things will take place, let's begin looking at chapter 17. First, we have the advice of Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel was someone who was considered very, very wise. And in fact, the text tells us that his advice had always been treasured. It had always apparently been correct and helpful whenever it was sought. But the situation here is that Ahithophel's advice is going to be given to David's enemy, given to Absalom. So that's going to present a problem in that respect. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Now let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak, and make him afraid. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike the king only." So this is advice that Absalom would, of course, assume would probably be profitable to consider and perhaps to accept, because Ahithophel had been a wise and successful advisor before. Ahithophel's advice is to, as we would say today, strike while the iron is hot. He assumed that David would still be in a state in which he was not prepared to fight back. They'd be on the run. They wouldn't be in battle formation. They'd simply be looking for the necessities of life, trying to get by, trying to move away from Jerusalem. And this would be the time to attack. because David would not be prepared to fight. He also states, and this is important when you consider the fact that Absalom was the son of King David, the one whom Ahithophel said, we'll strike him down and bring everybody else back. There really won't have to be much of a battle. We'll catch him by surprise. We'll kill King David, and everybody else will come back, and you will be their king. So that's what we ought to do. That was the advice of Ahithophel. However, there was somebody else whose advice was going to be heeded. His name is Hushai. If you remember, he was sent back by David, who thought that he could infiltrate the court. He could be an advisor to Absalom, and he could counteract some of the advice that he knew Ahithophel was going to give him, and also so that he might provide, and by way of being a spy, he could provide information that he could send to David as to what Ahithophel was going to do next. And as it turns out, both of those things were true. After Ahithophel had spoken, Absalom said, now call Hushai the Archite also. Let us hear what he has to say too. So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the advice of Ahithophel. For the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. Now, Hushai's advice basically was this. He reminded Absalom that the men who were with David were fierce warriors, and they would fight to the death. They would fight viciously if they were encountered right now. By this time, Hushai says they'll be dug in, they'll be prepared. You're not going to take them by surprise. And if you go now, you're likely to suffer losses, and you're not going to be victorious like you want to be. And then everybody's going to be talking about it. All of Israel's going to be saying that Absalom is not the one that we want to reign over us. He wasn't even successful in this first battle. And because of all your losses, he says to Absalom, the whole group, everybody who's on your side is going to be demoralized. So here's what you do. You gather up all the soldiers you can, all the way from Dan to Beersheba, which of course is the entirety of Israel. That's all the folks that he could have gathered up. And you gather them up, and they'll go, and you'll have a huge army, and they'll catch up with your opponent. And if they meet him in the field, they'll beat him there. If he takes refuge in a city, why, everybody in Israel is going to come with ropes and pull down the walls of that city, and you will still take him if he takes refuge even in a city. So this is the advice that Hushai gives him, which is not wise advice, as it turns out. And we notice here that it is clearly identified, for the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel. So whatever reasoning was in the mind of Absalom, there was something that the Lord was behind in this particular decision to take the wrong advice, which resulted in eventually a victory by David and a defeat of Absalom, and eventually Absalom's own death. We remember back in chapter 15 of 2 Samuel, right about verse 31, David, during this time of difficulty, when he knew Absalom was coming with his army, said, "O Lord, I pray that the counsel of Ahithophel will be turned into foolishness." And he calls upon the Lord to do that. And apparently that's exactly what the Lord did, because it was not the advice of Ahithophel, but the advice of Hushai that was heeded. So God directed the advice, in this case, the counsel that was taken. And as a result, David was victorious, and David returned to be king, which was, of course, God's will. And, of course, all because of the circumstances that Hushai was there to do exactly what David had told him to do. But the fact that Hushai was able to give wrong advice to Absalom, which Absalom unknowingly accepted, was not all that he did, because Hushai now is going to send word to David. he's going to tell David basically that Absalom and his army are coming. What he needs to do is go on and cross the Jordan River, go on and get set up somewhere and prepare for battle. And so David knew what Absalom's plans were because Hushai had sent word to him. We notice the map again here. David was camped along with his forces somewhere in the general area there of Gilgal. He hadn't crossed the Jordan River until word comes to him. So he's still a good ways from a place of protection, actually a place where there were allies around him too, because they provided a number of things for him. So David has fled, Absalom controls Jerusalem, and now David is about to receive word, you need to go ahead and cross the Jordan River and be prepared for a fight. Again, Hushai intervenes. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have advised. So he tells them, the two priests that were actually on David's side, but they too stayed back so that they might be helpful to David in a secret way. He tells them that the advice that he had given and the advice that Ahithophel had given, and the fact that his advice had been accepted, and he wanted to get word to David. So they send the two sons, one of Zadok and one of Abiathar, to David with information. They're going to tell him what the plans are. And of course, they were trying to avoid being seen because the very direction in which they were headed would say to some people, well, these are spies. They're going to David's side. We need to do something about this. We need to report this to Absalom because they're up to no good. So they tried to avoid being seen. However, they were unsuccessful in that. And as they are not too far from the place where David was and his people who had not yet crossed the Jordan River, they were seen by a young man who reported it, and they had to hide. People came looking for them on behalf of Absalom, no doubt to either kill them or take them back as prisoners. However, they were among sympathetic people sympathetic to David and his cause. And so they came to a house that a man owned, and it said that he had a woman to hide them in a well in his court. And they covered that well with grain that was in the process, perhaps about to be, have its actual grain removed from the stalk, the husk, and all of that. And it looked like the well was being used for something else. Now, to appreciate this, we might think it's unusual to climb into a well. Wouldn't that be a difficult and a very unsavory place to hide? However, back then, what they called a well is not going to be like our wells today. It was more a reservoir, a place for the small amount of water that did come to them during certain times in that part of the country. And it would not be a very deep well. It would only serve for storage. And so it was a logical place for two people to hide, disguised by the grain and the seeds scattered around to indicate that it was really a place where grain was being processed after bringing it from the field. So these two young men, after those seeking them had come and gone, went on and went on to David and those who were with him and said, here's the plan, and you are encouraged to cross the Jordan right now and move on and prepare for what's coming. So that is what David did. And David was helped by a number of people. The text says the people who were with him were hungry and weary and thirsty. And help came from many different directions, from places that some were on that map a moment ago, some were not. And the people that helped him, we're not sure exactly who they are. Scholars aren't sure. It could have been some Gentile nations, people not of Jewish background who were sympathetic to David, or it could have simply been Jews who lived in cities that were named by the Gentiles, and so they were identified in that way. But whoever it was, several of them came and brought supplies to David, were obviously his allies during this time of the rebellion by Absalom. They helped him, and later on, he would reward them. He would remember them and be thankful for their assistance at this time. Now, meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, here's what we read. Now, when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey and arose and went home to his house, to his city. Then he put his household in order and hanged himself and died. And we don't know exactly what was in Ahithophel's mind at this time. Certainly, he was insulted by the fact that his advice was not taken. And this man, whom he probably thought was an ally of David, his advice was taken. Also, it may have been that Ahithophel thought things are not going to go well, and eventually they're going to come back and blame me for something here, if anything happens to Absalom and his army. And so he thought he might as well go ahead and commit suicide. We don't know why exactly, every detail, for the fact that he did this, but he did kill himself after his advice on pursuing David was not accepted. Now, the battle comes about after Absalom gets to this land of Gilead. And we see here in the next chapter Absalom's defeat and his death. Now, the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." So we're going to stop right there for now. David prepares his men for battle. He divides the army into three. 1/3 is led by Joab, who's been his right-hand man, leader of his army for some time. And then 2 who are believed to be Gentiles, Abishai and Ittai. He divides his army into thirds. Now, this is not just a few hundred men who had been loyal to him back when Saul was chasing him, but by now we find that as he divided them, though we're not given exactly the number he had, it refers to breaking them down into groups of hundreds and thousands. So that means that he had at least 2,000, and probably more than that, since he divided them into thousands. And then he gave the job to these generals to take them in battle array and to go out and to meet the army of Absalom. Now, David very much wants to go and be present for the battle, but everybody pleads with him not to. They say, "You're more important than everybody else who's going to fight. We've got to keep you healthy and keep you safe." And so David reluctantly stayed back at the city where he was at, and he stood by the gates, waiting, no doubt, with a great deal of concern about word of how the battle was going to go. And so the people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, that is, those who came from the other side of the river with Absalom as his army. And a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. The battle took place in those woods that we looked at earlier, or the forest of Ephraim, we saw on the map. And we noticed that David's forces were very victorious, killing 20,000 of those who were on Absalom's side and trying to take his life and overthrow him as king. We also noticed that the woods, the terrain there, had taken more lives even than the sword. So we assumed there were marshes there were precipices, there were places where people would fall. There were various ways that people could get killed in the midst of these forests, for that many people to get killed doing that. And of course, if they were running for their lives in retreat, some of them might have been careless in their retreat and then fallen into something and it took their life. At any rate, that's what happened. Now, Absalom had been supposedly protected by David's statement. He told Joab, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." David wanted him obviously taken prisoner and not to be killed as some other opponent might have been. But we noticed that Absalom's fate was different than that. In the woods, he was making his way probably for an escape, retreating from the battle, and his hair got caught in a tree. Remember, he had long hair that he cut once a year, and it was weighed every year. He was known for his good looks and his hair. That hair was caught in a tree, and he was literally, the donkey ran out from under him, and he was hanging there helpless as the soldiers came upon him. So a soldier saw him, but he would not kill him. He did tell Joab about this. Joab said, "Why didn't you kill him?" He said, "Well, because the king said not to. The king said to not touch the young man," in the words we would use today. However, Joab was not satisfied with that. Joab went and he cast spears, darts of some kind into, it says, the heart of Absalom while he was hanging helplessly in the tree. Obviously could have been taken prisoner without a great deal of trouble. And then later, the armor bearers for Joab went and they finished him off if he were not already dead. And they made sure that he was dead by what they did to him. And then they took him, Absalom that is, and cast him into a large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. And of course, this was not the proper burial for a king's son. This was a symbol of disdain, a symbol of shame. It was saying basically that Absalom is a nobody. He doesn't deserve any better than this and to be thrown in a hole and covered up with rocks. And that's exactly what he did. Now, the text goes on to tell us, kind of as an aside, that Absalom had a monument built for him in the Valley of the Kings. He had done this because he apparently had no sons to carry on his name, to carry on his family's name, and to do things after him as part of the family of Absalom. And so he had this monument, and today it's called Absalom's Monument, or then it was called Absalom's Monument. And today there is still a monument in the Kidron Valley, just outside of the city of Jerusalem. And it is traditionally referred to, and by some thought to be, Absalom's Monument. Now, whether that is true or not, that was a long time ago, and we can't be sure. But certainly that is a possibility because many things are preserved from long ago, and that may be one of them, Absalom's Monument. Now it comes time for somebody to tell King David the bad news, because this has to be done. And in fact, after a battle in those days, the word of the battle was sent to the king as quickly as possible. It was important that he know what was going on. And so in chapter 18, as it begins, we're going to see that happening. Now, Ahimaaz, who was the son of Zadok, one of the two young men, the sons of the priest, who took word to David about the coming battle, was one of the ones that really wanted to go. Probably he wanted to tell David that everything is well. You can become king again. Your enemies are defeated in a significant way. So all things are well. He wants to go back. Joab is reluctant to say that because part of what he assumes Ahimaaz is going to have to say is, but your son Absalom is dead, because that was known at the time. And so Joab says, no, you can't go. I'm going to send this Cushite here. Cush being another name for, generally speaking, the area which we call Ethiopia today in a rough way, general geographic location. This Cushite was fighting in the army with Joab, and Joab says to the Cushite, you go and you give the message to King David and report to him what happens. So Joab sends the Cushite to give this message. The Cushite's not even named. That's how lowly of rank he was. And then Ahimaaz said, let me go too. Let me go too. After he reports, I can report. And so Joab doesn't really understand why he needs to go too, but he finally allows Ahimaaz to go and says, okay, go ahead and go then. But the Cushite is the one who's taking the news. It's already left. What happens is Ahimaaz apparently is a faster runner, or perhaps he was more motivated to be the first one there. He outruns the Cushite, and he is the first one there. And so when Ahimaaz gets there, he perhaps the first tendencies of regret get to him. He doesn't really want to talk about the fate of Absalom. And so he says to David, there's a great victory. You have a great victory that your army has won. And David asked about Absalom. And he says, well, there was some great big stir as he was leaving, and he's not sure what was going on. And so basically he deceives. He tells a lie because he, as far as we can tell from the previous text, he knew exactly what was going on. So after he had been there, David tells him, stand by the gate, stand here. They see another runner coming. Now, whenever there's one runner coming, they basically assume good news, because otherwise there might be your whole army might be fleeing back in panic if they were losing the battle. And Ahimaaz was someone who would assume was bringing good news because of who he was. He was very special to David's cause. So he brought good news in the sense that he was willing to speak it. And then another one comes, and again, they're still assuming, more news, more good news, and the Cushite arrives. And the Cushite said, there is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you. In other words, the battle, just as Ahimaaz had already told him, was in his hands. He had been victorious. And certainly the Cushite was excited to be able to tell him that. Something of an honor to bring the king good news. And the king said to the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? And that was really what was on his mind. No doubt other things were important, but this was upon his heart. So the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all those who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. Now that was a somewhat poetic way of saying that Absalom is dead. And the Cushite is suggesting all your enemies, may they be like that. May all your enemies die and you be safe as king, and you serve as king as long as you want to. That was the message. And so this message was a bittersweet one. Yes, David wanted to be king again. He wanted to rule as God intended. He knew he was God's intended ruler, but he was crushed by this news. So much so that his mourning took a direction in which a lot of the people were not comfortable with. And we'll read that as chapter 18 continues. We might call this part, David mourns for Absalom, because he's been killed in this battle. Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. Remember, he was standing at the gate of the city, waiting for news. And he'd had two messengers now, Ahimaaz, who simply told him it was a victory, and the Cushite, who said it's a victory, and your son is dead. May all your enemies be likewise. So he was at a chamber above the gate, weeping, perhaps not wanting to show his emotions in front of everybody. As he went, he said thus, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Some of the more emotional words, I would say, in the Old Testament. Here we have a father who perhaps knew this had to happen for God's will to be done, and yet the love of a father is not removed after all that Absalom had done. He's the one who had caused the problem to begin with Tamar, his half-sister. He's the family member, caused the problem with Amnon. And now he had caused this problem as far as rebelling and taking much of Israel with him. And David knows all this. And for some of us, it might be beyond understanding how you could look at someone, even your son, and say, I can deal with this. I can forgive him, even though he's done all of this and even was willing to let me be killed in the process. That's how much he loved him. He also perhaps might have been thinking, as some people would, was I the right kind of father to Absalom? That's a question that would have been natural. If I had restrained him perhaps when he was younger, if I had taught him God's ways more significantly, more intensely, more often, would he have been a different person, and would this not have happened? And so David has many, many regrets, perhaps, and pure grief over this son whom he loved in spite of all that he had done. Now, David is going to return to Jerusalem rather quickly. There's going to be a peace throughout Israel, even though there's just been a battle, and almost everybody is going to accept David as the real and rightful king. And we'll look at the exception of that toward the end of our study. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends." Now, Joab had a way of talking very straight to King David. Sometimes we might wonder how he got away with that. David must have had a great deal of confidence in some way, respect for Joab, because Joab spoke to him in a way that generally no one spoke to a king, even if they were close advisors to them. The text continues, "For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, then it would have pleased you well." And again, that's a very direct and painful statement for him to make to David, although it was actually true. Joab had to have a lot of courage in order to say that. Basically, what he was saying was, David, you aren't showing appreciation to the people who just a few hours ago were risking their lives for you, the ones that you should be rewarding, the ones that you should be saying thank you to. Not only are you not showing gratitude to them, but you're in your mourning and you're ignoring them. You're acting like you wish Absalom had lived and all of them were dead. That's what he's telling David in a very, very forthright way. Now, David is brought back to reality, it seems, by this message, because he does begin to talk to the people. In fact, that very day, he calls everybody and addresses them from the gate of the city. This is before he's going to go back to Jerusalem. And he did thank them, and he declared what he should have been declaring all along. Now, a little after this, it turns out that people on both sides are ready to get back together for the most part, and for David to return to Jerusalem and take his rightful place as king. And it says beginning in verse 14, "And he bowed the heart of all the men of Jerusalem, even as the heart of one man, of Judah rather, so that they sent his word unto the king, return thou and all the servants. So the king returned and came to Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king, to conduct the king over Jordan." So here we have a great reuniting that was good for God's people, and they are ready to accept David as king again. And not only do they send word that they are, but a host of them come over to the Jordan River, where he's going to have to cross over from the east side of the Jordan River to the west side of the Jordan River in his journey to Jerusalem. Near Gilgal, they come over to meet him, and by their very presence, they indicate that we accept you as a king, and we want you to go back to Jerusalem. We want you to rule over us. So in that sense, for the most part, unity was truly reestablished, and David would rule then for several years to come. Now, as David comes back, it could have been the case that it would have been an opportunity to take vengeance on those who had not been his supporter during this time in which he was challenged by Absalom and Absalom's forces. However, he does what he'd done all along. He shows mercy to, for instance, this man called Shimei. Shimei was the one who had cursed David and kicked dust at him and thrown rocks at him as he was on his way out of Jerusalem running for his life from Absalom. And at that point, David spares his life. He could have sent a soldier up right then to kill Shimei, but he says that not going to do that. If it's God's will, he'll come back and be king again, and God would give him credit for this. If not, it was up to God. So Shimei is doing this, and David will not let anybody else take his life, even because of his disrespect to the king. Remember, Shimei was a distant relative of King Saul, and perhaps that would be the reason why he hated David so badly. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was come over Jordan. He didn't waste any time in coming to try and make up for his mistakes. And said unto the king, let not my Lord impute iniquity unto me, neither do thou remember that which thy servant did perversely the day that my Lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. And so Shimei literally fell on his face and gave us a very great example of repentance. He stated his wrongs. He asked for forgiveness. He didn't qualify what he had done wrong. He knew that. David knew that. And he mentions it here and asks for the king to forgive him. He continues saying, for thy servant doth know that I have sinned. That's an important part of repentance too, saying, I have sinned. Sometimes people might want to qualify that a little bit, might want to tone it down and not use the word sin. But when that's what's happened, that's the terminology that's used in true repentance. I have sinned. Therefore, behold, Shimei says, I am come the first this day of all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my Lord the king. He says, Lord, I'm sorry. Or to David, I'm sorry. I seek your forgiveness. And look, I've come all this way, first one to ask for it. I want you to know that I sincerely feel this way. And that certainly seemed to be the case. And David, once again, had the forgiving spirit that he so often displayed, even when people were against him, even when people tried to kill him and otherwise cause him pain. He also meets this Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who was hurt when his nurse was carrying him out after the battle in which Saul and Jonathan were both killed, and he fell and he was crippled from then on. And he had been eating at David's table. David had vowed for Jonathan's sake to take care of him. And so David was doing that. But when David left Jerusalem, Mephibosheth did not come. And there are two stories. Remember, the first story was Ziba, who was Mephibosheth's top servant, the one who took care of his land, his property, and saw to all of that, who did not have the property because Mephibosheth had it. And then there's the other story that Mephibosheth is going to tell when he gets a chance to see David. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came again in peace. And it came to pass, when he was come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said unto him, Wherefore wentest thou not thou with me, Mephibosheth? Now, in other words, David wanted to know, where were you when those who were loyal to me went with me and left Jerusalem instead of waiting around? And we remember that Ziba had told David that Mephibosheth was just sitting there waiting for Absalom to get there and hoping that wrongs would be corrected when Absalom got there, because he was the house of Saul. And it could have been that he was feeling some hatred toward David because of his relationship with Saul's family. Could have been he was looking forward to David perhaps getting defeated, maybe even killed. That's what Ziba told David. And David then gave Ziba possession of everything that Mephibosheth owned. He didn't wait to do his homework. In a moment of stress, he just gave it away. And we see here that Mephibosheth had been in a state of mourning. You see, these are not matters of hygiene here. hadn't dressed his feet, hadn't trimmed his beard, washed his clothes. Those were signs of a person suffering, of grieving because of what was happening to David. And then he tells David the story in another part of this text. He said, Ziba said, I'll be back for you with a donkey that you can ride. I'll come back and get you, and you can go with us. And Ziba did not do that, because apparently Ziba had a plan in mind for recovering this land and taking away from Mephibosheth. And so, and when David hears and understands this, he says to Mephibosheth then that half of the property will be given back to you, and Ziba will keep half. And so he forgave Mephibosheth when he knew what the facts were. Now, as we get close to the end here, we come down to basically the one other major event in chapter 20 that we want to look at, and that is the rebellion of Sheba. Not a lot is said about Sheba, but we know that he and a number of people with him who were influenced by him refused to accept David as king, and that resulted in a rebellion. We begin reading in first verse of chapter 20. And there happened to be there a man whose name was Sheba, and he blew a trumpet and said, We have no part in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tents, O Israel. And so what we have here really is rebellion number 2. Absalom's rebellion had just been put down, and now Sheba's ready to start another one because of whatever reason he has a hatred toward David, and he wants to raise up these people who would resist David and perhaps overthrow him. Perhaps Sheba had his eye on the throne, or perhaps there were other motivations. At any rate, he brought about a rebellion. Now, during this time, David had appointed a new general. We aren't told a lot about why, but we are told that instead of Joab, he appointed a new general whose name was Amasa. And he gave orders for Amasa to gather everybody together, gather all his soldiers that he needed, because if somebody didn't do something about Sheba, this is going to be worse than the last rebellion. And so he says, you get them together, and in 3 days, you have them together, and you go after Sheba. Well, Sheba was closer than he would have been later. Well, Amasa delays. We aren't told why he delays. It could have been something that was beyond his control, unexpected, or it could have been simply that he had his own issues toward David. We're not explained that one way or the other, but he delays. And so after the time appointed, David says to Joab, he said, you're in charge again. He said, you take charge, you get the soldiers together, and you pursue Sheba. And that's exactly what Joab and David's forces did. They go on the way to find Sheba. Along the way, they run into Amasa. And Joab salutes him as if everything is okay. But then when he gets close enough, he kills Amasa. Perhaps there was some jealousy involved. Perhaps it was because he disobeyed David intentionally. Perhaps it was because Amasa had treason on his mind. We really don't know. However, he was killed by Joab as Joab makes his way with the soldiers to pursue Sheba. Now, he reaches Sheba. He overtakes him near a city or beside the city called Abel. And the city of Abel was known for wise people and had been apparently for some time known for wisdom. And he prepares to besiege the city. In other words, they'll build up something to the walls to be able to go over them eventually and fight their way in, or they'll starve the people out, whatever they need to do to get this person. But while he's doing this, he prepares to besiege the city. A woman speaks to him over the top of the wall, and she says, why are you doing this? He explains, and she says, what if we send you the head of Sheba? Will you go away? Will everything be okay? And in a sense, she was a wise woman. She knew what was going to happen, and a lot of innocent lives are going to be taken in the battle if there was one. And she knows that Sheba's life is all that's going to be demanded here. And so a little while later, they do come. She throws Sheba's head over the wall of the city, at the feet of Ahab, and that's what it takes. Joab had agreed that that was the only reason they were there. With Sheba dead, then everything would be okay. With the leader now cut off, the rebellion was apparently put down. And so the wisdom of this woman, perhaps others inside the city, prevent a lot of bloodshed that did not have to take place and did not take place. Well, that's our study of chapter 17 through 20 of 2 Samuel. I hope you'll be with us next week when we talk about the remainder, chapters 21 through 24, and lead up to the final events in the life of King David. Again, this is how you can get in touch with us if you'd like to. Many videos on our website if you'd like to look at those, including the rest of this series, which began with 1 Samuel and now is just about to end next week with 2 Samuel. We're glad that you've watched. I hope it's been a blessing to you. And again, if you want to contact us for whatever need there might be, we hope that you will do that.